Welcome back. As I was listening to a recording of a Bible study I had with Jehovah's Witnesses, I started to think about why the organization, the Jehovah's Witness organization, is so dangerous. And in this Bible study I had with these Jehovah's Witnesses, I am continuing to discuss with them the 144,000, who can go to heaven, who is the anointed class. And I haven't posted this particular Bible study on my channel yet, but I'm showing this man some verses that really should open up his mind and contradict the Watchtower teaching. But he responds to these verses with just a simple statement. The 144,000 are the anointed. And we start to go through some other verses, and he just responds, well, the anointed are the 144,000. And then maybe like 3 to 4 times in our Bible study, anytime I would present a verse and ask him a question, he wouldn't really even respond to my question. He just would say, the 144,000 are the anointed, or the anointed are the 144,000. Well, we know the 144,000 are the anointed. Like the circular statement, he's not really dealing with the verses in front of him. He's just saying the statement. And it got me thinking on how terms are presented by the Watchtower and how important language is, and how they present a term or they present a word, they give it a new definition, or they reframe it in a certain context, and they say it over and over and over and over again to have its own meaning, the organizational meaning, very similar to the truth, the term the truth, or even the name Jehovah. And in this same study with these Jehovah's Witnesses, we are reading through Enjoy Life Forever, chapter 4, and towards the end of it, the chapter calls to watch a video. And it's about a woman in Cambodia who was presented with the name Jehovah at some point. And whether or not these videos or these stories are true is irrelevant, because the idea is true. She meets this man named Harold, this Jehovah's Witness man, and he introduces her to the name Jehovah. He's like, just like my name's Harold, God has a name and it's Jehovah. And so Harold goes away and she tries to go to another church, but they're not using the name Jehovah because she has already been indoctrinated at that point with the name Jehovah and how that is God's name, and anyone who doesn't use it doesn't have the truth. And it is, how do you find true religion? They use God's name, and that is Jehovah. And so that's really what this video is about. She's already been indoctrinated. She goes to a church. She calls out the priest or the pastor, and he's like, well, you don't have to be there. So she leaves. Then she gets reconnected with Harold, and she becomes a Jehovah's Witness, and everything is fine and dandy yet. But really, that video is an example of loaded language. Even the Jehovah's Witness who I was meeting with at the time, that's an example of loaded language, where they see things from a certain perspective, and these words are either trigger words, or they can't see past this phrase that's been introduced. Or if the name Jehovah is not there, then all of these ideas come to their mind about how that church is bad or doesn't have the truth, because they do not use the word Jehovah. And as I'm thinking about this and reading about this, I come across a book which I think I'm late to the game on. It's called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert Jay Lifton. And so in this book, it's really interesting. This is somebody who presents a framework for thought reform. This is not somebody who was involved in a cult. This is not somebody who is trying to dissect the Jehovah's Witness religion. He's actually was a psychiatrist, and he did some research in the 1950s centered around American POWs, so prisoner of wars, and even Chinese civilians, and how they were essentially brainwashed or indoctrinated by the Chinese Communist Party. And he prefaces his book with the fact that he's presenting what has happened. He's done this research, but it's not like the main crux of it is not because communism is necessarily bad, like that's a side issue. It's the nature of the techniques that are being used and the impact it has on human beings. And so, why are Jehovah's Witnesses and the religion, the organization, what it does, why is it so dangerous? It's dangerous because it impacts human potential. And so, oftentimes in videos where a criteria is presented on how to identify a cult or how to identify a high control group, it's easy to kind of go through the checklist. Well, it checks off this. And while that might be true, what I'm going to do today is really dissect the impact it has on the individual and on the person. And so I'm going to read you a quote from the book. We're going to go through the criteria and really talk about the impact it has on the nature of an individual. So a little bit more about Lifton. When he went to Hong Kong, there were others who were asking the same questions that he was asking, other scholars, other diplomats, and they were wondering what happened to these individuals. You have university students, American POWs, psychiatrists, bishops, Western missionaries even, that really underwent this re-education or thought reform under the Chinese Communist Party. And these individuals, a lot of them eventually, they were able to come out of it and they couldn't believe the things that they said or did or renounced when that they were under this type of re-education or this thought reform, this indoctrination. And so that is really what prompted this research, because, and where he spent time with these individuals to create this framework. And so that is a little bit of the background here. So I won't make you watch the entire video to find out why the Jehovah's Witness organization is so harmful. Ultimately, it's because, yes, it does meet this criteria of thought reform, but what does this framework do? What do these things have an impact on? Ultimately, it's that it destroys human potential. It removes their ability to think, to reason. It takes away their creativity, imagination, conscience. And as Lifton describes in the end of chapter 22, not only does it destroy human potential, it evokes destructive emotions, produces intellectual and psychological constrictions, deprives humanity of all that is subtle and imaginative, all under the false promise of eliminating those very imperfections and ambivalences that help define the human condition. And so as we go through these 8 things, you will see this to be true. So the first, what's called a psychological mechanism, the first point here is Milieu control. So this is control of social and environmental factors, and creates this dynamic of the worldly versus non-worldly, that controls the information that the member of the organization would receive. And so you have the bad information, no access to that information, which Jehovah's Witnesses would call apostate literature. And so they're not allowed to access information that goes against their beliefs. I'm going to read you a quote from Lifton's book here. It says, "He is deprived of the combination of external information and inner reflection which anyone requires to test the realities of his environment and to maintain a measure of identity separate from it. Instead, he is called upon to make an absolute polarization of the real, the prevailing ideology, and the unreal, everything else." And so this is what the Jehovah's Witness religion does, the Watchtower does, the organization does. You cannot access this information, these apostate websites, apostate literature. They have gone through extreme lengths throughout the years to discourage this, to shame this, to punish this as well. But Lifton describes this as you're really taking away an individual's ability to determine truth for themselves. So think about the verse in Jeremiah, "And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." A human being is very complex. Jesus says to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. We are not one-dimensional here, and our heart is complex as well. But in Jeremiah, it says, when you search for me with all your heart. And Jehovah's Witnesses, they can have this in their literature, and they probably have repeated this verse a million times, but I don't think that they actually understand that they are not searching. They are not seeking, because that ability has been taken away, and it's actually frowned upon to do that. Why? Because the organization literally tells them what to believe, hands it to them. This is the truth. Don't worry about that outside information. You shouldn't read that outside information. Those are apostates. They hate the truth. They're going to be annihilated, right? Like all of these things, and us versus them. You are not searching for God. You are actually being presented information on what to believe. So there is no internal struggle. There is no internal determination of truth. You are not actually even coming to this realization of who God is or what is truth, because it's being presented to you forever. Searching for God is a lifelong endeavor, even for Christians, even for me who believes, yes, I have found the truth in Christ, but seeking him on a daily basis, searching for him, loving him, that continues. That will always continue. But with an organization like Jehovah's Witnesses, it's actually taken away, and your identity is removed from it. So the individualism, who you are as a person, the internal wrestling with trying to find truth, that is all removed. The second point is what Lifton calls mystical manipulation. And this is when events are orchestrated to make it seem like it's divine, or there are leaders that speak divinely for God. They're unquestionable. And with the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's clearly the faithful and discreet slave class. They're the ones that dispense truth. They're the ones who can't be questioned. They're the special chosen individuals to dispense this truth. This can also be applied to a false Christian group that claimed certain healings, or gold dust falling from the sky, or legs being grown or healed, and that is God. But really, they have certain machinery that presents like a certain feeling, right? There are churches out there that do this, where they have like gold dust and glory clouds, and it's really all manipulation. That is an example of it too, an example outside of the Watchtower. And the impact this has on human potential, I read it straight from the book, but whatever his response, so this is, think of a Jehovah's Witness's response to being manipulated. I have questions. Something doesn't sit right. Let me talk to an elder here. And then it's turned around on them. We hear these stories all the time. Shame and guilt on them for simple questions. So, but whatever his response, whether he is cheerful in the face of being manipulated, deeply resentful, or feels a combination of both, he has been deprived of the opportunity to exercise his capacities for self-expression and independent action. So again, we're talking about why is Jehovah's Witnesses, why is the religion so dangerous? It's the impact it has on human potential. It takes away your independent action. It takes away your ability of self-expression. It takes away your ability to think and reason, to really come to conclusions for yourself, because truth is always given to you and presented. This is what it is, and there's no question about it. Point 3, a demand for purity. This is the black and white thinking that is presented within the organization. This is their morality, their rules that cannot be questioned. And when this happens, the organization is the arbiter of morality. They're the ultimate judges of good and evil. They use guilt and shame as emotional levers to manipulate the members. So Lifton uses the phrase ideological totalist. And so this is the organization that is being the arbiter of truth, of enforcing this type of morality, this black and white thinking on the member, and really messing them up emotionally. And so he says that once this individual has been subjected to this type of polarization of good versus bad, black and white, they really start to lose the ability to not only determine morality for itself, but just the complexity of it, the sensitivity to it, how it is, the conviction of it. That is what is being impacted here. That is what is being taken away from this individual, from a human being. So I'll read straight from the book here. Moreover, once an individual person has experienced the totalist polarization of good and evil, he has great difficulty in regaining a more balanced inner sensitivity to the complexities of human morality. For there is no emotional bondage greater than that of a man whose entire guilt potential, neurotic and existential, has become the property of ideological totalists. And so what happens here when you become a member of Jehovah's Witnesses and they present this black and white thinking, they have given themselves over to the organization, to the totalists, to the control group, to this organization here that tells them what is morality and presents this extreme polarization of good versus bad. There are certain things that are clearly black and white and not things not to partake in, things to partake in, but there's also just a deeper sensitivity to it when you are a Christian, when you do have a relationship with God. And even if you're not, you probably have personal convictions too of what you're determining is right and wrong. But that is something that you are wrestling with yourself, not an organization that you are subjecting yourself to. The next point is cult of confession. And what this describes is the member has to confess their sins, their shortcomings, their failings to an organizational leader. And if they don't, they have guilt, they have feelings of guilt, and they have feelings of shame. But when they do that, it's often used against them in a manipulative way. And we hear these stories too, that a Jehovah's Witness went to their elder, confided to them about something they did. Next thing you know, they're in front of a judicial committee going over what they did. And then there's a consequence to it. There's a punishment to this. True confession is good for the soul. It's encouraged even in the Bible, but confessing to those who you have a loving relationship with, confessing to those who you have a trusting relationship with. And it's not to be used against you or used to shame you or guilt trip you. So this here is almost like a suffocation of your conscience, because now when you need to confess things, you can't, because you feel like you're going to be ostracized, or this guilt and this shame will be placed on you. And so you don't. That's not good for your heart. It's not good for your soul. It's not good for your mind. And then maybe you're manipulated in the way of like, well, I should do this because the organization requires me to. It's just a very twisted way of confession. Your sin should not be used against you. The purpose of confession is, as far as in human relationships, to restore that relationship, and in a relationship with God, to be in fellowship with God again when you confess to Him your sins. It's a good thing, and it restores relationships. It's not something that should be used against you to manipulate you. The fifth point is what Lifton calls sacred science. And so this means that the group's teaching is the unquestionable truth. It is absolute. It cannot be questioned. And doubt is viewed as sin, ignorance, or you have some ulterior motive. What they present is science. So anything presented against it is unscientific. That is the idea here in Lifton's criteria. Critical thinking is discouraged. So now we have the mind is being impacted when it comes to human potential. Now, like your ability to think, your ability to reason, your ability to wrestle with truth, all those things are being taken away from you. I'm going to read a quote here from Lifton's book on how he describes this point. So this is the member of the organization His quest for knowledge is consequently hampered, since in the name of science, he is prevented from engaging in the receptive search for truth, which characterizes the genuinely scientific approach. And his position is made more difficult by the absence in a totalist environment of any distinction between the sacred and the profane. There is no thought or action which cannot be related to the sacred science. To be sure, one can usually find areas of experience outside its immediate authority, but during periods of maximum totalist activity, like thought reform, any such areas are cut off, and there is virtually no escape from the Milieu's ever-expressing edicts and demands. Whatever combination of continued adherence, inner resistance, or compromise coexistence the individual person adopts toward this blend of counterfeit science and backdoor religion, it represents another continuous pressure toward personal closure, toward avoiding rather than grappling with the kinds of knowledge and experience necessary for genuine self-expression and for creative development. So what happens here when you become a Jehovah's Witness, you're a member of the organization, you're part of this organization where you cannot question truth, that if you question, it's viewed as sin or ignorance. Doubting is essentially wrong. What happens in that scenario is that a door is shut with inside that individual, and they're no longer grappling with knowledge and really what it takes to determine truth for themselves. So there is this door that shuts. It's no longer my problem, and anything creative, imaginative, internal grappling with is cut off. And so what we're seeing here, when an individual becomes a member of a high control group, when an individual becomes a member of the Watchtower, they get baptized, is they slowly are shutting down that person, and they are taking away their ability to think, their ability to reason, their ability to grapple with truth, their ability to, even their conscience is being impacted because confession is distorted. Everything is distorted. Everything is controlled. Everything is manipulated. And their mind is being shut down. Their heart is being shut down. And the things that make an individual a person, is they're shutting it down. And so on the outside, they're living, they're breathing, but inside, what makes an individual tick is gone. And so, again, Jesus says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But each one of these areas are being impacted. And if you're not a Christian, you know that human beings are complex too. And like, this is like a complete control of the entire individual that's shutting down. Number 6 is loading the language. And this is how I started. When the organization presents words, terms, they redefine them, they put all this definition in them to where the individual can no longer think for themselves. An organization like the Watchtower takes language, takes these terms, even biblical terms, they put their own definitions to them. They take complex ideas and simplify them. And what this does to the person is it impacts something that's really vital to being a human being, and that's language. Language is such a central part of the human experience. And now Lifton, as he described it, is summed up in constriction. So now they are constricted to these words and to these definitions, and there is no way out of it. They cannot think out. It impacts their ability of self-expression. So language is a way that we express ourselves, and even how we think, because now my terms, my definitions are so restricted, so confined, that there is no alternative to it, especially since if I'm a member of the Jehovah's Witness religion, I've already been isolated, and outside information is shamed upon or frowned upon to look at. And so we discussed the information, my ability to think, my ability to reason, my heart, All of these things are being constricted, are being narrowed, are being hampered, are being controlled, and now even language is being controlled as well. The seventh psychological mechanism that Lifton presents is called doctrine over person. And what this describes here is that an individual can have a certain experience that contradicts the doctrine of the group, but it is deemed as false. So a member of the group needs to conform their personal experience to the group's, what the doctrine is. And you can totally see this if you've ever talked to Jehovah's Witnesses, because they all have the same story. When I first started talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, it's like they all said, oh, I looked at all the other religions and I came across this one deemed to be true. And it's like, okay, well, what have you looked at? And this is like their testimony. This is their story. And it's probably not true, which impacts the integrity of an individual, because now they are forced to present their life story, what they think, what they believe, even their experiences in light of what the doctrine is. It needs to be in line with the doctrine, and nothing can contradict that. And this impacts somebody's integrity, it impacts their sincerity, it impacts them as a person. And Lifton goes on to say, in a totalist environment, that absolute sincerity is demanded. And that is expressed usually in complete doctrinal compliance. And so if a person thinks differently, has a different experience, they're not allowed to express that. So it impacts self-expression as a human, but it impacts their integrity and their sincerity, because now they're forced to obey, forced to comply, and being subjected to the doctrine. So the final psychological mechanism is dispensing of existence. And what this essentially means is those who are in the group, they are valuable, but everyone outside of the group, they're not valuable. They are equate to spiritual death, spiritual damnation, and it's really an us versus them mentality. And if you stray too far from the path, you are in danger of that. And so existence for an individual becomes dependent upon creed, dependent on believing the doctrine, whatever that doctrine is at the time. If you've studied with Jehovah's Witnesses or looked into the Watchtower at all, you know how many changes there have been since inception. Literally, it's making things up as they go for the last 100 plus years. And yet their salvation is dependent upon creed. It's dependent upon what is being taught at that time. And so it's interesting because it's an us versus them mentality, but that us is dependent upon the information that's being dispensed, the doctrine that's being taught at that time. And that can change. And it always changes. There's always new light. What this does to an individual is impactful. What this does to an individual is simply that their entire existence is dependent on what is being taught. And so they compromise. Even if they don't really believe it, there is this, what Lifton calls as personal closure. So you're putting aside your individualism, you're putting aside your personal convictions, and you are subjecting yourself to the doctrine, the dogma, the totalists. So Lifton says in his book that the more an environment expresses these 8 themes, this criteria, the closer it is to being an ideological totalist. And the more that organization uses these themes to change people, the more it is to thought reform, which is brainwashing. So in conclusion, the reason why Jehovah's Witnesses are so dangerous is because how the Watchtower uses thought reform and the ability it has on a person, how it shuts down their creativity, how it shuts down their ability to use language, how it shuts down their conscience, their ability to search for truth, the struggle for truth, the quest for knowledge. All of these things are shut down to where a person is no longer thinking, seeking, feeling, self-expressing, whether in terms of emotion or confession or language, any of that on their own. It is completely controlled and suppressed and hampered and suffocated. And that is the impact of thought reform. That is the impact of this criteria. So I really wanted to just emphasize this because it's not just theories of, okay, does this organization meet these certain criteria? But these are people who are being impacted negatively, who are being affected. But also, as a Christian, I believe we're made in the image of God. And being made in the image of God, we are asked to love him with our entire being. This right here shows that the Jehovah's Witness religion is false because they're not loving him with their heart, soul, mind, and strength. They don't have the ability to. All of that is discouraged as we have gone over. So if you're studying with Jehovah's Witnesses, or you're currently a Jehovah's Witness watching this, or your family is in the Watchtower, I hope that you found this video helpful to really understand the impacts that this religion has on a person. So remember, the next time you're talking about thought reform or even the bite model, remember that it ultimately impacts who God created an individual to be. It ultimately impacts their human potential. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments about this. Have you read Lifton's book? Have you come across his work before, or other thought reform criteria as well? Thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting. Please subscribe to my channel and let me know what you think.